Welcome to Learning Thursdays. My name is Crystal Hewitt-Gill with the OASAS Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. Today's presentation is part of our Year of Cultural Competency series and is titled Personality Disorders and Substance Use. And our presenter today is Jessica Sniatekki, an Associate Professor at the College at Brockport at SUNY. Jessica will be joining us in just a moment, but first a word about Learning Thursdays. Learning Thursdays are offered to behavioral health professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge and skills of the New York State substance use disorder workforce as we strive to improve the lives of individuals needing prevention, treatment, and recovery services. A goal of Learning Thursdays is to support the professional development of the treatment, prevention, and recovery workforce. We do this by offering free and regular presentations that are relevant to today's substance use disorder treatment professional. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to contact us at the Learning Thursdays mailbox. You can use the same mailbox to express an interest in providing a future Learning Thursdays presentation. And now it's time to start the presentation. Welcome to our presenter, Dr. Jessica Sniatekki.
Hello everyone. As mentioned, I'm Jessica Sniatekki. I teach at SUNY Brockport in the Alcohol and Substance Abuse Studies program in the Healthcare Studies department. And I'm going to be talking to you today about personality disorders in general and how they relate to substance use disorders, as well as having a more specific focus on antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, which are the most common ones that we see in substance abuse treatment. Most of my clinical work has been working with clients with dual diagnosis, so this is a particular area of interest and passion of mine. So we're going to start out with a general overview of personality disorders. So as defined by the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, a personality disorder is an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture, is pervasive and inflexible, has an onset in adolescence or early adulthood, is stable over time, and leads to distress or impairment. Now there's a couple things to note within that definition that are particularly important. One of the first is that the disorder is pervasive and inflexible. So it should really be present for the majority of the person's life and be resistant to change, which is why we experience less success often in clinical interventions for these disorders as compared to some of the other disorders that we may treat. It also has a typical onset in adolescence and early adulthood, and the reason that that's particularly important for substance abuse counselors is that that's also the time when we often see people engage in their initial substance use, which can make diagnosis and discerning what's really going on a little bit challenging. So in terms of statistics, what I should note as well is that a lot of this, the information in this PowerPoint is taken from a text that's referenced at the end of the presentation by the authors Daly and Moss, Dual Disorders, Counseling Clients with Chemical Dependency and Mental Illness. And you'll see some other citations throughout to indicate some other sources that I've used. Okay, but personality disorders, when we look at the general population, we see that about 10 to 20% of individuals experience these disorders, but we see that the numbers are very elevated for people that are actually in treatment. So among clients who are in mental health treatment, about half of them will be diagnosed with a personality disorder, and among people with substance use disorders, a little over half, 60%, are estimated to also meet criteria for a personality disorder. Okay, so there are a number of personality disorders with a variety of symptoms, and we can see impairment in several areas. These can be related to distortions in how people perceive themselves, other people, and or the world, problems with emotional expression or affect, difficulties in relationships, and poor impulse control. Again, there's a lot of overlap with substance use disorders there. Okay. What we also see in general with personality disorders is behaviors that are either underdeveloped, overdeveloped, or both. Okay. So behaviors are another significant area of impact, as well as cognition. Okay? So distorted thinking, as well as difficulty controlling emotions. And depending on the specific personality disorder at hand, we may see more or less impairment in these particular areas. So the DSM has 10 categories of personality disorder diagnosis, as well as a personality disorder NOS, or not otherwise specified category. And these disorders are organized into 3 clusters based on perceived shared characteristics. Okay, so they're clusters A, B, and C. And I am going to give a general overview of the DSM criteria for each of these, and then we will get much more in depth with the 2 that affect clients with substance use disorders the most, antisocial and borderline. Okay. So the first cluster are a group of 3 personality disorders that are categorized together based on having features that are odd or eccentric. Okay. And when we look at the DSM organization of personality disorders, what we see is that each one has a hallmark characteristic that the person has to have, and then a number of other potential criteria of which the client has to meet a certain number to qualify for that diagnosis. Okay. So for paranoid personality disorder, the first listed in cluster A, the hallmark characteristic is paranoia, or a pervasive distrust or suspiciousness of other people. And that also entails that the person expects malevolence from others. In other words, thinks that others are out to do them harm or treat them badly. Okay, so the person has to have that, and in addition has 4 or more of the following criteria. They might see others as exploiting, as malicious, or as deceitful, and not to be trusted. Because of that, they're often preoccupied with unjustified doubts about others. So this suspicion or paranoia is not grounded in something that's actually happened in reality typically. This also is likely to make them reluctant to confide in others. Okay, they may see hidden meaning in benign remarks or comments, so things that are not intended to be malicious are interpreted that way by a person with paranoid personality disorder. In addition, they might tend to bear grudges and sees themselves and or their reputation as being under attack really at all times. And then a final criteria that might occur with this disorder is the person having recurrent suspicions about their partner's fidelity or whether or not they're being faithful to them. Schizoid personality disorder also, again, has a hallmark characteristic, a defining characteristic, and then a list of possible related characteristics. So this one, although the prefix may spark your thoughts of schizophrenia, it's really quite different from schizophrenia as a diagnosis. It doesn't have that those psychotic features in which the person's out of touch with reality. Instead, schizoid personality disorder is defined by a pattern of detachment from social relationships, as well as restricted affect or emotional expression in interpersonal settings. Okay. Along with that, the person will also demonstrate at least 4 of the symptoms that I'm going to describe. First, they may not desire or enjoy any close relationships. Okay. Someone with this personality disorder also tends to prefer solitary activities. They might have very little, if any, interest in a sexual relationship or experience with another person. In addition, they tend to demonstrate anhedonia, in which they take very little, if any, pleasure from activities in life. Okay. Probably not surprisingly, a person with schizoid personality disorder tends to lack close relationships, so they may have limited friendships or close acquaintances other than their immediate family. Okay. Someone with schizoid personality disorder also tends to appear pretty indifferent to any kind of criticism or praise. So they don't respond to feedback from other people in the way that we might think is typical. And finally, in terms of their emotional expression, someone with schizoid personality disorder tends to come across as pretty cold or indifferent or detached in those experiences. One of the things that I often encourage people to think about with this one is that people with schizoid personality disorder, often we don't see them in treatment very frequently because they might find a niche in life in which they fit in and in which these characteristics are not problematic in their day-to-day experiences. We might imagine, for example, a career in which someone can work from home or work in an office on a very solitary basis and not have to engage with people or have a lot of interpersonal interactions very frequently. So this personality disorder often tends to actually affect the people around the person with schizoid personality disorder more profoundly. Again, you might imagine if you had a sibling with this disorder and they weren't really interested in a relationship with you or engaging with you in a meaningful emotional way, how that might affect you. But again, someone with this personality disorder might not have an interest in that type of a relationship. All right, so the final one in this cluster, cluster A, again, those that are odd and eccentric, is schizotypal personality disorder. And this one, again, has that prefix, but is the one that's a little bit more related to psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. We're going to see a little bit of commonalities in terms of the features I describe. Okay. The hallmark characteristic here is also a deficit in interpersonal and social relationships, but coupled with cognitive distortions and eccentric behavior. Okay, so you have to have that. And then some of the possible symptoms includes odd beliefs or magical thinking. So drawing conclusions that are inconsistent with what most of us might assume is real or factual. And these would be inconsistent with the person's culture. The person might also experience some unusual perceptual experiences. They typically would not be at the level of a full-blown hallucination, but they might see things like auras, for example, or have other sensory experiences that most of us do not have. They might also demonstrate some odd thinking or speech patterns, inappropriate or restricted affect. Okay, so again, their emotional expression not matching the situation at hand. Ideas of reference, odd, eccentric, or peculiar behavior or appearance. Similar to schizoid, a person with this personality disorder may also demonstrate a lack of close relationships. So they might not have very many friends or close acquaintances, again, other than first-degree relatives, so their immediate family. And another possible feature of schizotypal personality disorder is that the person may experience excessive social anxiety that does not lessen with familiarity. So it's not just an initial anxiety about approaching new relationships or experiences. It's going to be more persistent than that. Right. And this is thought to be rooted in some paranoia about negative judgment. Okay. The next cluster of personality disorders, and really where we see some very elevated numbers for clients with substance use disorders, is cluster B. And so cluster B personality disorders, there are 4 of them, and these are grouped together based on the shared characteristics of being dramatic, emotional, and or erratic. Okay? So for now, I'm going to skip over antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorders criteria because we are going to come back to this in a great deal more depth. But I will give you a brief overview of histrionic and narcissistic. Okay, so histrionic personality disorder, the hallmark characteristic here is excessive emotionality and attention seeking. Okay? And then as well, we might see someone who is uncomfortable in situations where they are not the center of attention. And that can also be coupled with an interaction with others that involves provocative and sometimes sexualized behavior. In addition, the person often demonstrates rapidly shifting and shallow emotional expression. They may use their physical appearance to also draw attention to themselves, so this might be based on their body language, their style of dress, etc. Someone with histrionic personality disorder may also demonstrate a style of speech that is quite impressionistic and kind of lacks a lot of detail. So again, there's a lot of surface level drama, if you will, for this personality disorder. Okay. Similarly, the person may show theatricality and an exaggerated emotional expression. Okay. So again, the emotional expression here is going to be elevated in conjunction to the situation at hand. Okay. Someone with this personality disorder may also be suggestible, meaning that they're easily influenced by others' suggestions or ideas. And a final feature here is that a person with this personality disorder may consider relationships to be more intimate or intense than they actually are. Okay? So there may be that kind of gap in understanding in terms of who they engage in relationships with and how each person views that particular relationship. The final personality disorder in this cluster is narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. This personality disorder is characterized by a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. Okay. This is probably one that people have heard of, at least in terms of narcissism. So a person generally with this personality disorder tends to have a very inflated sense of self, okay, or sense of self-importance. Okay. In addition, they may experience and sometimes be preoccupied with fantasies of power, success, fame, etc. Oftentimes, someone with narcissistic personality believes that they are special and therefore should only interact with or give attention to others who they deem to be special or high status. Someone with this personality disorder may also require excessive admiration. There tends to be a sense of entitlement. Okay. And as a result of that, they might be really interpersonally exploitative. In other words, they may take advantage of other people. Okay. A person with this personality disorder also lacks empathy. So they are limited in their ability to understand people's situations, to try to imagine life through another person's eyes. A person with this personality disorder may also experience envy towards other people and or believe that other people are envious of them. And finally, they tend to show arrogant or haughty behaviors and attitudes. Now, someone with true narcissistic personality disorder can be quite disruptive in the therapeutic process. That's certainly something to note. You might imagine, for example, someone in a group therapy who's unable to really give any positive feedback or relate to others in ways that are helpful. I've certainly encountered this on a somewhat limited basis, but in my own clinical work, in which there was a need to make sure that certain clients weren't taking advantage of other clients or weren't kind of continually being very negative in their comments, again, believing that they were of a higher status than other clients with whom they were in treatment. And so this one can be a bit disruptive if we see this in a clinical context. Okay. I should also point out here that while we certainly have these 10 diagnoses, it's possible for people to demonstrate characteristics of personality disorders without actually meeting full criteria for a diagnosis. So if some of the characteristics I'm describing remind you of someone you know, just keep that in mind, right? We can have people who demonstrate some narcissistic qualities. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have narcissistic personality disorder. All right, our final cluster in the DSM is cluster C, and these personality disorders are grouped together based on the shared characteristic of anxiety or fearfulness. Okay, so the first of three here is avoidant personality disorder, and this disorder is characterized by a pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. Okay, so someone with this personality disorder is really kind of held back in social situations because they feel like they're not good enough and that they will be judged by others. Okay? So they also have to have 4 or more of the following symptoms I'll describe. It's common that someone with this personality disorder will avoid work activities that involve interacting with other people, again, due to that fear of criticism, disapproval, or rejection. In addition, a person with this personality disorder tends to be unwilling to get involved in activities or relationships with others unless they are certain of being liked. And how often does that occur in life where we are certain that we're going to be liked, right? That can pose some real challenges for a person with this disorder. In addition, and not surprisingly, what this means is that the person usually shows a lot of restraint in the relationships that they do engage in. Again, largely rooted in that fear that they're going to be ridiculed or rejected. That fear of rejection or criticism is a source of preoccupation, right? So their ability to engage with people is also limited in that sense, okay? And certainly holds them back in new interpersonal situations and interactions. Okay? Part of what this is rooted in is the next criteria, is, in that the person may view themselves as unappealing or socially inept and inferior to others. Okay? So they're kind of expecting that other people are going to view them in the same way. And what this also may lead to is the person being unwilling to take any kind of personal risk or engage in new activities. The second personality disorder in this cluster is dependent personality disorder. Okay? So the hallmark characteristic of this one is dependency, or a pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of that leads to submissive, clingy behavior and fears of separation. Okay, so you have to have that, and then at least 5 of the ones that I'm going to describe. So the first is difficulty making everyday decisions without an excessive amount of advice or reassurance from others. Okay? So everyday decisions. So the example I often use to describe this one is if I was going to go buy a new car today, I probably would at least give my husband a call and give him a heads up that that's what I was thinking about doing. But if I needed to call him to decide whether I was going to get a turkey sandwich or a tuna sandwich for lunch today, that might be more similar to dependent personality disorder. So it's everyday decisions that most of us might not think twice about making. This person might experience a real challenge in doing that. In addition, what we might see is that the person wants others to assume responsibility for their life. Okay, so again, that heavy reliance and dependency on others. They may have a real challenge or difficulty in expressing any kind of disagreement with others because they fear the loss of those relationships. The assumption is that if they disagree, then the person may end the relationship or won't approve of them anymore. Someone with dependent personality disorder also often has a lot of difficulty starting any kind of projects or activities on their own. And they may go to excessive lengths to obtain nurturance and support of others. Okay. A person with this disorder is also highly likely to feel really uncomfortable or helpless when they're alone. And one of the behaviors that we may see that demonstrates this is for someone with dependent personality disorder, sometimes when they have a relationship end, an intimate relationship, they will almost immediately start a new relationship. And then the final possibility is that someone with dependent personality disorder may have excessive and unrealistic fears about being left to take care of themselves. Okay. So our final personality disorder in the DSM is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Probably many of you have heard of obsessive compulsive disorders. That it is actually classified as an anxiety disorder, but we're certainly going to see some overlap in terms of some of the characteristics. Okay? But one of the things that defines this as a personality disorder is that pervasiveness. What we're going to notice as I read through the criteria is that these symptoms really affect all areas of the person's life. And with obsessive compulsive disorder, the obsessions and compulsions tend to be confined to particular areas and activities and objects in the person's life, rather than being so pervasive and all-encompassing. So a person with this disorder has a pattern, again, here's the hallmark symptom, has a pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental and interpersonal control at the expense of being flexible, open, and efficient. And then at least 4 of the following. They might be preoccupied with details, rules, lists, organization, or scheduling. They're going to often demonstrate perfectionism that interferes with task completion. So I always tell my students that a healthy dose of perfectionism is good because it allows you to hopefully turn in a good product and make sure you're using spell check and those kinds of things. But if your paper is never good enough to turn in, that's going to be a real challenge for you in college or at work, etc. A person with obsessive compulsive personality disorder may also be excessively devoted to work and productivity to the exclusion of leisure activities and friendships. So someone that might be called a workaholic could potentially fall into this category as well. It can also be displayed by a person who is really over-conscientious or inflexible about rules, morals, and values. And a final potential characteristic here is the inability to discard worn out or worthless items even when they have no sentimental value. And so, as many of you may be familiar with, hoarding disorder was actually added in DSM-5 as a standalone diagnosis. But prior to that, obsessive compulsive personality disorder was what some individuals who demonstrated that type of behavior may have met criteria for. Okay, so again, a little bit of the kind of general information about treatment of personality disorders. Many of the clients that we see with personality disorders actually seek treatment for something else. Okay. Most of us don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with our personality per se, it's just who we are. And so usually what we see is that clients with personality disorders come into treatment for something else, and then their personality disorder is detected through evaluation or clinical interaction. Okay? As we saw in the definition, these disorders as a whole tend to be pretty inflexible and much more difficult to treat than some of our other disorders. But some clients do respond to medication interventions as well as counseling interventions. Okay? And some of the ones that we may see employed with clients with personality disorders are cognitive behavioral techniques, dialectical behavioral therapy, which has particularly shown some success with borderline personality disorder. So again, a little more on that later, as well as interpersonal therapy approaches. Okay? Group therapy has also shown some promise for clients with personality disorders, but this is an area also in which we lack research to really help us guide best practices. Okay, so we are now going to get a little more in depth with the top 2 personality disorders that we are likely to see among clients with substance use disorders. Okay? So the first is antisocial personality disorder. Okay? This personality disorder is the most common among clients in substance abuse treatment. And you may see abbreviated APD or ASP, depending on the source that you are looking at. Okay? When we look at APD prevalence in the general population, it's about 3% for males and 1% for females. So much higher proportion among males. And highest rates of diagnosis are in the 25 to 45 age group. Okay? It's estimated that about 1/5 of clients in substance abuse treatment meet criteria for APD. And when we look at it from the flip side, among people with APD, how many have substance use disorders? The ECA is the Epidemiological Catchment Area Survey. Was a big national survey that looked at a whole number of psychological disorders. You'll see that referenced a couple of times. This research study found that 80% of clients with antisocial personality disorder will meet criteria for a substance use disorder at some point in their lifetime. Okay? I also pulled in a recent study here by Ogloff and colleagues from 2017. And this study examined a group of 130 men, and they were looking at the co-occurrence between antisocial personality disorder and substance use disorders. And what they found is that among these 130 men, over 90% of them had a substance use disorder at some point in their lifetime. Okay? It was also noteworthy in this study that for mental health disorders in general, the co-occurrence with substance use disorders was 67.6%. So, certainly this number is extremely high for antisocial personality disorder, but dual diagnosis is really relevant throughout our population and in a whole number of areas. There's also been some research that's examined whether there's any variation for antisocial personality disorder based on race, ethnicity, and there have been no conclusive differences to date. Antisocial personality disorder is thought to share some kind of genetic basis with substance use disorders. Okay? So I think we're pretty confident at this point that there is some kind of biological/genetic component of substance use disorders. And one of the areas that's been explored and hypothesized about is whether perhaps this high rate of comorbidity may be explained, at least in part, by some kind of genetic commonality. Okay? So hopefully more to come on that in the future. I think we still know relatively little about the human brain, although we know a lot more than we did 25 years ago. But perhaps we'll see some interesting findings in this area as we move forward. Antisocial personality disorder also often goes hand in hand with other types of life challenges, so psychosocial issues. So certainly substance use, but we also see that people with APD are more likely to have lower socioeconomic status, experience employment issues, etc. Okay? It also frequently co-occurs with other types of disorders. So substance use disorders, of course, but also things like depression, anxiety, gambling disorder, and even other personality disorders. And that's certainly an important thing for clinicians to note, that someone can be diagnosed with more than one personality disorder. Okay. One of the things that is somewhat unique about antisocial personality disorder, in contrast to the others that we are discussing today, is that antisocial personality disorder has a required precursor diagnosis. In other words, a diagnosis for which the person must have met criteria for first in order to then be considered for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, and that's conduct disorder. So conduct disorder is a diagnosis of adolescence, okay, and is really based in a lot of persistent patterns of behavior that reflect violating the basic rights of others or violating age-appropriate societal norms and rules. Okay? So I'll just give you a very brief overview of conduct disorder. It can involve things like aggression to people and animals, so being a bully or threatening or intimidating others, actually inflicting physical harm on others, getting into physical fights, for example, using weapons in such altercations, being physically cruel to people or to animals, stealing, or forcing someone into sexual activity. It can also involve destruction of property, so fire setting or other types of vandalism, deceitfulness or theft, breaking into people's homes, buildings, or cars, lying, in other words, kind of engaging in that process of conning others, shoplifting, forgery, etc. And or can also involve serious violation of age-appropriate rules. So breaking curfew consistently, truancy from school, running away from home, etc. Okay, so someone has to meet criteria for conduct disorder to be considered for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. But it is important to note that they don't necessarily have to have had an official diagnosis. A clinician, if they are evaluating someone for APD, can retroactively, assess whether they would have met criteria for conduct disorder had they been evaluated as an adolescent. Okay. There have been a number of studies that have also looked at this co-occurrence of substance use disorders with conduct disorder. And so I included one here, Brennan Hyde and Baskin Summers. And they noted that conduct disorder was associated with an increased risk of substance use disorders, as well as a greater severity of symptoms, and also found a strong relationship with aggressive and or criminal behavior. Okay? And certainly that is part of the criteria for both conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Okay? So let's look at the actual diagnostic criteria for APD. Okay? So the hallmark characteristic of antisocial personality disorder here is a pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others since age 15. Okay? And this is going to be coupled with 3 or more in the following list. So failing to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior. BX is behavior. Sorry, I have some abbreviations that I used to use as a clinician that I thought I removed, but I guess there are a couple left in here. So what this is going to look like is repeatedly engaging in behaviors that are illegal, for which the person could be arrested, whether or not they were actually apprehended. It also may involve deceitfulness, so lying, having different aliases, forging documents, or engaging in cons. We might also see impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, so kind of not thinking through the consequences of one's actions. Irritability and aggressiveness are quite common, often manifested in physical fights and assaults. Okay. Disregard for the safety of self or others. Consistent irresponsibility, where we often see that demonstrated is with regard to their work obligations, their home obligations, and or finances. And then lack of remorse. Okay, so a person with antisocial personality disorder really might not feel badly about these behaviors that they're engaging in that are violating the rights of others or not demonstrating respect for others. Okay. As I noted, this one has to have conduct disorder before age 15, again, either as a formal diagnosis or assessed retroactively. And these behaviors are not due to another diagnosis, okay? And the two that the DSM points us to particularly examine here are schizophrenia or mania, which would be associated with bipolar disorder. Okay? Antisocial personality disorder is the most commonly diagnosed personality disorder among people in substance abuse treatment. Okay? But one of the things that I saw as a clinician and that I really want to make sure I emphasize in this training is that a lot of these criteria are things that we might see people demonstrate in active addiction. So it's really important to remember that if someone truly has antisocial personality disorder, those characteristics and behaviors should persist in sobriety. Okay? And I'll give you just one clinical example of my own. So I worked with a client once who had experienced a crack cocaine addiction, and when I was working with him, he had a few months of pretty solid recovery. He also had an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis. And when he was in active addiction, I think he met every criteria on this list. He had engaged in some pretty disturbing behavior in terms of some of the things he had done in particular to get money to fuel his use. He had done things like rob his neighbor who was elderly at knife point, these kinds of things. But in my opinion, at that point, after having established sobriety, he really wasn't demonstrating any of these behaviors and characteristics any longer. He was extremely remorseful about his actions and really had a lot of respect for the rights of others and their well-being. But in active addiction, he did not demonstrate these things. Okay? Many of the clients with whom we work, for example, are engaging in illegal behaviors, might be being very deceitful about their use or about some other things that they're engaging in. Impulsivity, very common with substance use disorders, as well as irresponsibility. So as clinicians, I think it's really important that we advocate for our clients in these areas and consider whether there may be some misdiagnosis, particularly for this personality disorder among clients in substance use disorders. Because again, if it's truly a personality disorder, it should persist, whether or not the person is in active use or in recovery. Okay. So outside of the actual DSM diagnoses, there are some general characteristics that we also want to be familiar with when we think about APD. So the interpersonal interactions are particularly affected by this personality disorder. Someone with antisocial personality disorder is really going to engage in relationships in ways that serve to meet their own needs, often at the detriment of other people's needs. Okay? So another client that comes to mind that I think their APD diagnosis was a bit more accurate, would talk about some of the plans he had for engaging in different con schemes and things. At the time that I worked with him, for example, he would talk a lot about things like opening credit cards in his 3-year-old son's name. And when I would ask him whether he was concerned about the impact on his son's future, he really didn't seem to care about that very much. Okay, so it was more focused on how he could meet his own goals and desires. Okay. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder often tend to have a lot of challenges in their relationships. Okay. Their ability to express warmth and kindness and care and concern in a relationship is often very limited. Okay. In fact, they may be pretty suspicious of many of the emotional interactions that we might perceive as typical in relationships, things like compassion, kindness, etc. Okay. And because of their lack of ability to be empathetic, the reciprocity, the give and take that most of us expect in relationships might be a particular challenge for them. Okay? They may not be interested in that form of a relationship, or they just might not have the capacity to really engage in that process. Okay? Another thing that I want to note related to that is that like many mental health and substance use disorders, antisocial personality disorder has been linked to trauma history. And so many individuals who meet criteria for this personality disorder have experienced significant trauma in their lives. And so this may also be related to some of the difficulties that they have in terms of engaging in relationships and relating to other individuals. Okay? Again, I want to emphasize that this is a lifelong pattern. So for people that truly have antisocial personality disorder, we should see these types of behaviors, types of emotional expression, and ways of relating to other people persist both in active addiction and sobriety. Okay. A couple other things to consider with antisocial personality disorder. Clients with this personality disorder tend to have a low frustration tolerance. In other words, they don't like to feel uncomfortable. They may get irritated quite quickly in treatment if we are kind of pushing them a little bit or challenging some of their thoughts or approaches to situations. Okay? They tend to seek very immediate gratification. Right? Again, they tend to prioritize their needs as being more important than the needs of other people, and their goal is to get those needs met as quickly as possible, no matter the cost. People with antisocial personality disorder may, for lack of a better word, fool you at the beginning. Many of them may initially present as quite charming. They may have found that this type of approach, at least at the initial stages of a relationship, has been successful in getting their needs met. Okay? And so it is possible that clients with this personality disorder may go undetected for a brief period of time. However, usually they're unable to maintain that facade for an extended period of time. Okay? Clients with antisocial personality disorder also tend to really lack self-awareness. So their ability to do self-reflection or develop insight about the ways that their behavior affects other people in particular is going to be quite limited. Okay? One of the areas in which we are most likely to see clients with APD enter treatment is due to some type of coercion. Okay? So as we saw in the criteria, people with APD are highly likely to engage in behavior that is illegal. So if they are apprehended for such behavior, we may see them mandated to treatment. Okay? We also touched on the strong co-occurrence of APD with substance use disorder. So again, they might initially be mandated to attend substance use treatment, and then the clinician or the evaluator may detect that there is also something happening with their mental health that needs attention. Okay. So finally, we'll look at a few of the treatment considerations for clients with antisocial personality disorder. One of the biggest challenges in my experience, and also based on the research in working with clients with antisocial personality disorder, is developing a positive and productive therapeutic relationship. So as we know, our relationship with our clients is of primary importance in terms of treatment success and really building the foundation for our clients to assist them in meeting their goals. Developing a therapeutic relationship with a person who may lack respect for you and or for other people can be particularly challenging. Okay? As clinicians, we also have to be mindful that a client with APD may be trying to manipulate us to also get to the goal that they have in mind. There can additionally be power struggles that emerge. Again, clients with antisocial personality disorder may be used to engaging with people that they are able to manipulate and take advantage of. And so as clinicians, when we are setting boundaries with these clients, there may be some challenges there. Okay? And we also may need to be mindful of our personal beliefs here. Recognizing that working with clients with dual diagnosis can be particularly challenging. And we may have to do some of our own work, both through self-reflection, supervision, et cetera, to make sure that we're approaching these clients in ways that are particularly beneficial to them. And that we're also being mindful about how we're framing success and how that might look different for a client with antisocial personality disorder as opposed to a client without antisocial personality disorder. And so, again, as an example of that, the client I mentioned that would talk about engaging in cons that might have a negative impact on his son. One of the things that I had to work really hard on is empathizing with him, because some of the things he would express and the ways in which he would express them certainly caused a bit of a reaction in myself that I had to be really mindful of and really examine in supervision to make sure that I was still demonstrating that unconditional positive regard and trying to find ways to support him and help him meet his goals, and while still maintaining healthy boundaries. And so in that situation, actually, he was a person who had experienced some significant trauma, and it was way back in his case file. And so one of the things that really helped me in working with him is that when I uncovered some of those details that he hadn't yet shared with me about his significant childhood trauma history, it made me understand him a bit more and think about how, given some of the things that he had experienced, ruining his son's credit probably seemed like a relatively small thing in contrast to some of the things that he had endured as a child. Another specific treatment consideration for clients with antisocial personality disorder is violence. So as we saw in the diagnostic criteria, aggressiveness and even engaging in physical fights, altercations, possibly even sexual assault can be behaviors that people with antisocial personality disorder demonstrate. And so we want to make sure that we are continuously evaluating whether there is any potential for or engagement in domestic violence, child abuse, etc. And one area that's been explored in terms of treatment interventions for APD is something called empathy training. Treatment approach that is designed to help people with APD try to garner some of that empathetic approach and understanding to other people with whom they interact. But really there is a lack here in terms of specific interventions and approaches that we can employ with people with APD to affect change. And so again, we may see more come out in the research, but we don't have a lot of specific techniques that have resulted in a lot of success in changing these approaches to life and problematic behaviors that we see for clients with APD. Okay, so the next personality disorder that we are going to look at more in depth, which is the second most common personality disorder among clients with substance use disorders, is borderline personality disorder. Okay. So when we look at the general population, borderline personality disorder is the most common. Okay. But among clients with substance use disorders, it's the second most common, which I have a little further down. Okay. And antisocial personality disorder is the most common among clients with substance use disorders. Okay. So for borderline personality disorder, the research, body of research estimates that about 15 to 25% of clients in mental health treatment meet criteria for this disorder. Okay. A recent study by Troll and colleagues estimated that about 2/3 of people with borderline personality disorder have a concurrent substance use disorder. Okay. And so they looked at both current and lifetime. You see the numbers there. This was a literature review. So Troll and colleagues actually examined a whole host of studies that took place from 2000 to 2017, looking at the co-occurrence of borderline personality disorder and substance use disorder. And they found this really strong association here in that a little less than half, 45.46% of individuals with borderline personality disorder had a current substance use disorder. And when they looked at over the course of the people's entire lifetime, about 3/4 of them had a substance use disorder at some point in their life. Okay. When we look at it from the other side, so among people with substance use disorders, how many have borderline personality disorder? We see this really wide range, and what that is the result of is simply a variety of findings that have occurred in different studies throughout the literature. So 5 to 43% of clients with substance use disorders also having borderline personality disorder. Troll and colleagues examined this direction as well. And what they found is that about 1/5, 22.1% of individuals who had substance use disorders also had borderline personality disorder. And they found this strong correlation even after controlling for other covariates. And they looked further at what were the types of substances that these individuals were using. Okay, so to kind of go back up to that 2/3 statistic, when they looked at people with borderline personality disorder who also had substance use disorders, they found that alcohol was by far the most common substance that was used. When they looked at the prevalence of borderline personality disorder among clients with substance use disorders, they found a little bit more variety. So again, alcohol was very common, but they also found that there was a high incidence of cocaine use as well as opioid use. Okay? So as substance use clinicians, certainly we want to be mindful that those might be 3 of the types of substances that if we see a client who has a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, those might be 3 that we want to be particularly mindful of. Okay. A couple other criteria in terms of prevalence and general occurrence. So unlike antisocial personality disorder, which is more common in men, borderline personality disorder is much more common in women. Okay, so about twice as many women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder than men. Okay. More recent thinking about this personality disorder has encouraged us to think about it as more of a spectrum disorder. Okay, so we've seen a similar shift in the DSM in thinking about autism and putting it on more of that spectrum from high to low functioning. And so this is what we're now being encouraged to think about for borderline personality disorder as well. I'll come back to this when we look at the criteria, but I want to mention now that this personality disorder is also very strongly associated with trauma history. And so there has been some discussion by DSM developers and in the literature about whether this personality disorder might be better characterized as a trauma-based disorder. Okay, so it's possible that we may see some shifts around the ways that we categorize this cluster of symptoms in the future. Okay. Borderline personality disorder can be a bit of a tricky one when it comes to diagnosis. Okay, so it can certainly coexist with other disorders, and what we're talking about today, dual diagnosis or comorbidity. It can also contribute to other disorders, so it can pose particular challenges for things like substance use disorders, things like depression in terms of worsening of symptoms, and it can also mimic other disorders. In other words, it can look like a variety of disorders, which makes proper evaluation and diagnosis especially challenging. Okay. It is considered to be one of the most severe personality disorders in terms of the substantial impact that it has on clients' lives. And it also shows some strong connections with challenges in family history. Okay. So what we see as patterns among individuals with borderline personality disorder is that trauma, as I mentioned, addiction, and mental health issues are often present in the family of origin. Okay. So borderline personality disorder has a uniqueness compared to the other personality disorders that we've been discussing today, in that it has two hallmark symptoms. Okay? The first is a pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affect. Okay? Affect, again, is emotional expression. And then the second characteristic that must be present for diagnosis is marked impulsivity beginning in early childhood and present in a variety of contexts. And then a person with BPD will also have at least 5 of the ones in this list. Okay? Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Okay? So a person with this disorder really fears that people in their life are going to leave them, and they engage in extreme efforts to prevent that, or at least try to prevent that. Okay? Unstable and intense interpersonal relationships that alternate between the extremes of idealization and devaluation. Okay? In other words, a person with this personality disorder, if you are in a friendship with them, one day they may think that you are the best person, they love you so much, you're the greatest, and then the next day, or perhaps even sooner than that, they may really not want to interact with you, they don't think that you're a good person, you know, etc. And so what that often means is that the people around the person with BPD don't really know what to expect in terms of their interactions. Okay. Identity disturbance is also quite common, most typically manifest in an unstable self-image. So a person with borderline personality disorder often doesn't really know quite who they are, and that really poses some challenges in the ways in which they interact in the world. BPD also involves impulsivity in at least 2 areas. This can include a whole host of types of behaviors, but some of the most common are substance abuse, sex, gambling, even things like shoplifting, right, risky behavior, etc. Another possible criteria or possible symptom of borderline personality disorder is recurrent suicidal behavior, threats, gestures, or self-mutilating behavior. Okay? I think it's really important to note here that self-mutilating or self-harm behavior is not the same as suicidality. Self-harm behavior is a coping skill for many people, albeit an unhealthy one. And so I've had clients describe to me how it provides them some kind of emotional relief, and that somehow that engaging in that type of behavior, such as cutting, burning, etc., is a way of them coping with emotions that they don't know a better way to cope with. So I think one of the biggest things that we can do to help clients with that type of behavior is to try to provide them some alternatives for getting those needs met in a more healthy way. Okay. The suicidality that can also be present means that as clinicians, we have to be really mindful of continually assessing safety for clients with BPD and putting in place things like safety contracts for clients who are experiencing suicidal ideation more frequently. Clients with borderline personality disorder also experience affective instability due to mood reactivity. That is a really fancy way, essentially, of saying that clients with borderline personality disorder are likely to experience a lot of changes in mood that are rapid, and therefore we also see rapid changes in their emotional expression. Okay. People with borderline personality disorder also often have chronic feelings of emptiness. Okay, again, what I found is that this is often linked to the unstable self-image. They don't really know who they are inside. Many of the clients with whom I've worked who have BPD lack direction because they're just not really sure where they want to go in life, whether that's career or relationship or otherwise. Okay. Anger can also be a characteristic of borderline personality disorder. So inappropriate or intense anger or more subjective report of difficulty controlling anger. Okay. The final symptom that we may see is transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So let's break that down a little bit. So transient means passing, right? This will be more short-term. But people with borderline personality disorder may experience the paranoid thoughts, usually linked with some kind of stressful situation. Okay? But once the person's out of that stressful situation, those tend to dissipate. Okay? Dissociation is something that we probably most frequently associate with trauma and can occur in two main ways. Depersonalization, when the person feels like something's not really happening to them personally. They might describe it as kind of looking down on something happening to them, or feeling like they're out of their body when something's happening to them, or derealization, which is feeling like it's not real, right, or it's not really happening. And so here we see that connection to trauma again. In that this dissociation, which again is very common with things like PTSD or with people who experience sexual assault, being a diagnostic criteria here, or possible diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. Okay, so coupled with that, we have some other characteristics and considerations that we might take note of when we're working with clients with borderline personality disorder. The first is the impact of this disorder on relationships. So as the diagnostic criteria notes, people with BPD have these intense and unstable interpersonal relationships. Okay? And what I have noticed and read about is that that often is coupled with the fear of abandonment. Right? So again, the person with borderline personality disorder tends to have these extremes in their approach to people between idealization and devaluation. Right? So people that they are in friendships or other relationships with don't know where they stand and often don't know what to expect day to day in their interaction with someone with borderline personality disorder. And so what tends to happen over time is that people kind of get tired of that pattern of behavior, and they may choose to end the relationship. And so the person's fear of abandonment sometimes actually comes to fruition, largely based on some of the behaviors that they're engaging in how they interact with other people. Okay. One of the ways that this can also manifest is through the characteristic of dependency. Okay, so this most often occurs when the individual with borderline personality disorder is in that phase of idealizing the person with whom they're in a relationship and really wants to spend all their time with them, might be praising them a lot, and it may feel a little overwhelming for the other person and a little too kind of clingy and dependent. And so again, might result in a consequence in that relationship that is opposite what the person is seeking. Okay. Individuals with this personality disorder also are highly likely to engage in black and white thinking, okay, or all or nothing thinking. And so we see, just like we see those extremes in relationships, we see those same patterns occurring in their, in the way that they perceive the world. Okay. And so, you know, either everything is wonderful or everything's terrible, right? No in between, no gray. Okay. Emotional instability is largely based on that mood reactivity, right? So people are often feeling like their emotions are not under their control, that they vary quite frequently, sometimes not even related to the situation. Okay. And what we might see, what I've commonly seen in clinical practice, is that borderline personality disorder coupled with another mood disorder, such as a depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. Okay. Impulsivity, we've certainly saw in the diagnostic criteria. Again, this could look like things like substance use, particularly when we think about our clients and clients who have substance use disorder and borderline personality disorder. That is a particular concern. Okay. Might also see impulsive behaviors such as promiscuity, shoplifting, fights or assaults is one I didn't mention, as well as self-harm behaviors. If someone has engaged in self-harm behaviors in the past, that could be one of the areas of impulsivity for them. Okay. Contradictory behavior. Again, I would encourage you to think about this in relation to those intense and unstable interpersonal relationships. People don't know what to expect often when they are engaging with a person with borderline personality disorder. And one of the phrases, I think I got this from a trainer at one point in a dual diagnosis training. So if the person's out there watching, forgive me for not giving you credit, but one of the phrases that's associated with borderline personality disorder is, "I hate you, don't leave me." Okay, so again, reflecting that push-pull that happens in relationships, as well as that fear of abandonment. In addition, those severe mood changes can really relate to this contradictory behavior. Right? So those aren't necessarily based on the context or the situation that the person is experiencing. So can lead to a lot of unpredictability in terms of the people that the person is interacting with, because they're just not sure kind of who they're going to be seeing that day. Okay. Anger, we certainly saw that reflected in the diagnostic criteria. This can be expressed as anger towards others. It might also be anger at themselves. Okay? And this might result for some clients in depressive symptoms. One of the ways that depression has been conceptualized is as anger turned inward. So we might see that kind of scenario for clients with borderline personality disorder. Mentioned self-harm and suicidality in the diagnostic criteria. Certainly something that we want to be particularly mindful of, even if we are a substance use clinician only. That is absolutely something that we want to be evaluating frequently and helping clients put in safety plans to ensure that they can manage those symptoms and have resources to draw on in those times. Okay. Low self-esteem and depression are quite common as well as feelings of emptiness or boredom. Okay? And again, keep in mind that a lot of these are linked to some of these problems that a person with borderline personality disorder has with their self-identity. Okay? Many people with borderline personality disorder lack the typical core sense of self, so they don't really know who they are. There might be a lot of confusion around what they want to do in life, and they may really have problems with goal setting, which of course can pose some challenges in the treatment setting as well. Okay? Some clients with borderline personality disorder experience some psychotic symptoms. Okay? So psychosis are simply symptoms that are out of touch with reality. Most commonly, we would think of hallucinations. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling things that are not there. Or delusions, which are fixed ideas that are out of touch with reality. For clients with borderline personality disorder, if this is simply a component of their borderline personality disorder, these would be transient. They would pass. Okay? And again, the research really demonstrates this strong linkage between borderline personality disorder and substance use disorders. Okay? Second most common among clients with substance use disorders. Some of the substances that have been linked with borderline personality disorder in the literature are prescription medications and alcohol. Okay? But there certainly can be a variety of others. Okay. So finally, we're going to look at a few of the counseling considerations for working with clients with borderline personality disorder. Okay? One of the most important areas of focus for working with these clients, somewhat similar to antisocial personality disorder, is the therapeutic relationship. Okay? However, the considerations here are going to be a bit different. Okay? Clients with borderline personality disorder have some major challenges around engaging in relationships in healthy ways. And that is certainly going to hold true for the therapeutic relationship. Okay? That is both a source of challenge as well as, I would suggest, a great source of information for us as clinicians. I tend to be a firm believer that the behaviors that we see in the clinical setting are reflective of the behaviors that our clients demonstrate in the real world. So I think, for one, we can use our interactions and relationships with our client to understand some of the ways in which they might engage with other people in their life. Okay? But clients may at least attempt to engage in that same push-pull that they engage with in other relationships, okay, where they might be idealizing our relationship in one moment and then really devaluing it or downplaying it in another. Okay? We may also see that tendency towards dependency play out in our therapeutic relationship, where you might have a client who is seeking a lot of your attention, for example, in a group therapy process, or calling the treatment site a lot, trying to get some additional support from you. So setting strong boundaries for clients with borderline personality disorder is really important. In some settings, these clients can have kind of a negative reputation because they may be seen as really needy and really draining a lot of the clinician's time. I worked with a lot of clients with borderline personality disorder when I was doing clinical work, and I really liked working with them. But I think part of that is because I tend to have pretty strong boundaries in general, and that was pretty effective for working with these clients. So certainly setting healthy but yet strong therapeutic boundaries can be really important for working with clients with BPD. I alluded to this a minute ago, but one of the challenges can certainly be that clients with borderline personality disorder can seem like they are constantly in crisis, okay? And they might feel like they are. And so helping them to develop coping skills and helping them to draw on resources other than you as a clinician or the counseling center can be really critical. Okay? There may also be attempts to split the treatment team among clients with borderline personality disorder. Again, their ability to engage in relationships in healthy and typical ways is limited. And so we might see behaviors similar to what we might see in children, right? When they try to split their parents or caregivers, right? They ask one parent whether they can stay out past curfew and they don't get an answer they like, so they ask the other parent, right? Same thing could occur in the treatment process, right? Maybe a client with borderline personality disorder is speaking about a particular area with their individual therapist and they don't quite like the information or response that they're getting, so maybe they speak with their group leader about it as well, right? So making sure everyone's communicating and is on the same page is really important for these clients, as well as most of the clients with whom we work. Okay. Medications have also shown some promise for clients with borderline personality disorder, particularly for those who have concurrent mood disorders or mood symptoms such as suicidality and depression. Antidepressants can be really helpful for such clients. There also is a co-occurrence with bipolar disorder. So for clients with borderline personality disorder as well as bipolar disorder, certainly mood stabilizers might be indicated. Okay? But one of the really important things while we're thinking about clients with dual diagnosis is monitoring and considering the potential for abuse or overdose, right? Impulsivity is certainly a strong characteristic of this particular disorder. So if we have clients that are taking medications, legitimate medications, that they could misuse, we really want to monitor that carefully. Interestingly, borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder that has shown some real success in response to a targeted therapeutic approach that was developed in part based on some of the challenges that clients with borderline personality disorder display. And that is DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. Okay. This is, oh, I left another abbreviation in. TX is treatment. Okay, so this is an outpatient treatment program. It has individual and group components, and it has a whole number of goals. Okay? Essentially, what DBT seeks to do is to integrate cognitive behavioral approaches with mindfulness. Okay? And so some of its aims are to help clients manage their relationship challenges. It looks at self-identity, which is certainly a challenge for clients with borderline personality disorder. Impulsivity, another challenge for clients with BP, as well as cognitive distortions. Okay? And it incorporates mindfulness techniques to assist clients in being able to monitor their bodily responses, their mood, etc., and then to implement coping skills and strategies in response to these reactions. Okay. It also helps clients to build and incorporate skills to utilize when some of these challenging situations occur. So interpersonal skills certainly, as well as learning how to better tolerate distress and stress in general in their lives. Okay. And it's really interesting when we think about the success that DBT has shown. Because again, the way that we think about a personality disorder is that it is enduring, pervasive, and inflexible. Okay? So to me, this does again raise the question of whether borderline personality disorder, the cluster of symptoms present, represents a true personality disorder, or perhaps whether this might be better conceptualized as a trauma-based disorder. So it will be very interesting to see how our field continues to expand its knowledge and perhaps modifies its approach to diagnosis in this area. I did also include a few references at the end of this PowerPoint if you'd like some more information. Again, Daly and Moss, the one that's listed at the bottom of this first slide, is a textbook that has a lot of the core information here, as well as some more current articles in the professional literature. I'll flip to the next one as well. There's a second textbook incorporated here, the Phillips, McCune, and Sanford, in case you're looking for another book, or you also have some additional current articles on this co-occurrence. Okay. And finally, you have my contact information here. Again, I'm at the college at Brockport in our Alcohol and Substance Abuse Studies program. And thank you very much for joining me today.
I want to again thank Dr. Jessica Sniatecki for today's presentation. I hope you'll all find it useful while assisting clients in need of services. Your feedback is important to us and highly appreciated. It helps us to know if we are meeting your educational goals and expectations. Once you have viewed the presentation in its entirety and completed the quiz, please follow directions to access the SurveyMonkey website and take a moment to complete the evaluation. Once again, thank you for joining us and keep up the good work.